I originally was not going to create a video of this nature. I have already made a PvE aspects video for what I hope to see in Dark Souls 2, but that's the big change right there. We now know that the next game will in fact be called Dark Souls 2. This isn't necessarily a proper correlation leading to a PvP video, but it's happening anyway. While this is a video based around what I hope to see in PvP, it all starts with one slightly more important aspect, that of jolly cooperation. You see, until recently I didn't care for co-op all that much. It's not that I didn't enjoy it, it's also not that I haven't enlisted help and also put my white sign down to give help. I have done both, and it has always been a great experience. Even those fights that ended up in losses, from a boss killing the host, or an invader proving the greater, have all been a part of the online experience. Here's the thing, however. I, up until recently, thought that what I love most about the Souls series is its desperation, the loneliness the player feels as they struggle to survive. You're a stranger in a strange, horribly violent land. But now, I have friends that are finally picking up the game because they can get it for $20 or even less. They were afraid of how the game might crush them for any higher dollar amount. Lame, I know, but that's off topic. One of these friends lives within a short distance, so he and I have been playing together. We sat in the same room and co-opted our way from the Taurus Demon to Quelaag, hitting the gargoyles, Capra, and the gaping dragon in between. We also fully explored the levels, my friend benefiting from my gross knowledge of the game, and I having played far too often. It was tons of fun, the most I've had with the game. Believe me, that's saying something, because I wouldn't make this many videos about a game that I am not fully in love with. Suddenly, it had become even more fun, and it was all because of the co-op. The consistent, well-functioning co-op. My friend is actually in the gaming business, or at least trying to be, unlike me, so the two of us have spoken at length about how to make improvements. A lot of it was nonsense and hopes set too high, but this next bit stuck rather well with both of us. Why can't there be an advanced co-op mode? In this mode, two players can meet up for as long as they'd like, challenging as much of the game as they can take on in one sitting. They do not get disconnected after every boss kill, nor after they are killed themselves. I know immediately that many concerns will pop into your head. They did in mine as well. As someone who operates by the current Souls system, a fragile, piecemeal system, I was alert to certain elements of the gameplay being broken. Mainly, invasions. Having players that cannot truly die does feel like it would entirely ruin the purpose of invasions. But hear me out on this. Here's how it works. When the host dies, or a white phantom dies, they are returned to the last rested bonfire. They pick up straight away and attempt to progress through the level again. When either of them, or hell, any of the three of them do end up dying, the mobs are reset. Currently, we know that this requires the actual world to be reset, hence why the player is stuck at the bonfire for a moment. The technology is only getting better, we should all hope, so why not a system in which touching the bonfire pops the enemies, but does not cause an actual reset of the environment? If one or two or even three of the players are standing where a mob should spawn, then they get hurt and knocked away. Or perhaps the mob simply spawns as near as possible. I'm hard-pressed to find where this would be a problem in the current Dark Souls. But what about invasions? Surely this system I am proposing would screw over that all-too-important aspect of the game. Well, not really. First off, think about the fact that it's not really all that necessary for an invader to ruin someone's game. They want the kill, absolutely, and to also kill the summoned phantoms feels wonderful as an invader. However, do you actually get enjoyment out of knowing that the people who you have invaded, who quite possibly were simply making a run for the boss, have now had the last hour of their game screwed over? If the answer to that is yes for you, then jump off a bridge or at least seek therapy. But otherwise, tune this thought in. As the invader, you kill the phantoms first for the sport of it, then kill the host, in an optimal invasion, that is. Do you really require that to be the end of the fight? Do you want it to be? What if you could remain in the game as long as you liked, scoring kill after kill? So long as you were never taken down, you would become a constant black phantom infection that was able to wreak unending misery. On the surface, that sounds like an even worse version of ruining the party's day, but it's not. Remember, the host and the whites get to keep coming back, spawning at the bonfire and running for the invader, or boss, by the way. They could still opt to avoid the invader entirely and make for the current boss, just as they have the option of doing now. This would mean, of course, that the invader is not sent home, not until all 2 or 3 opponents have entered the boss chamber. Actually, he may not even have to be sent home then. Why not stick around in the host world to monitor their success? If they fail, you have 3 fresh targets coming your way again. If they are successful in killing the boss, then you are sent home. This next small idea isn't mine, but I am unable to find who wrote it for me to give credit to, so if it was you, you had a fantastic idea and you should be delighted with yourself. That idea is a covenant that can also invade the boss chamber. Would be a hell of a challenge, which is what we all want, and would make sticking around in the world as an invader an even better option. If the host dies in the boss chamber, the phantoms are taken to the bonfire as well, and the invader can simply leave through the fog they entered, returned into the level. If you're thinking this creates a problem that the invader or phantoms could feel trapped in whatever game they happen to be in, stop. They cannot be. The black separation crystal already exists for anyone to voluntarily leave at their will. There's no reason this cannot still be true. The big question to still be answered, well, one of the big ones still left, is what then is the purpose of invading? Well, let's first leave out any qualifications for specific covenants. We don't know yet what those could be, and I don't want to speculate in that direction at this time. Instead, let's break it down into the 2 most important reasons people invade: for the fights and for the financial gain. By the latter, I mean you obtain souls and humanity. This would be true with every kill still in my system. By the former, I mean for the fun of it. Oftentimes, invaders are looking for the challenge of it, to go up against someone who might possibly be more skilled than them. Then also, there's the ideal situation for those who love to kill. They invade to murder some poor fool and his team if they are lucky. Ah, but what of their resources, you ask? And for that matter, what of the resources of the host? Is it necessarily fair for the host to have to spend their flasks and spells dispatching the invader, to then move on to the boss empty-handed? The problem I have with this question is that this is already an issue I have with the current iteration of the series. I've never liked how if you experience an honest invasion, meaning that you aren't dueling, griefing, or jumping, but that you are on your way through the level and you get invaded, you have to make the grueling choice of doubling back to the bonfire or hitting the boss with low supplies. An invader is not a part of the normal game, in that they can be calculated by the development team to create an appropriate challenge. What if you get invaded by a pro and win only by spending every flask and spell? That's cool, but shit, you only had an hour to play and really wanted to tackle the boss over yonder. The gaming session is spent, and I don't like it. I think that conquering an invader should have a greater reward than getting a humanity. Here's what I am working toward. Touching a bloodstain should refill your HP, flasks, spells, and anything else reset by the bonfires in the next title. It only makes sense. Now we can apply this to my fancy new co-op system. First, as the host, only the host would be able to collect these invader bloodstains, while the phantoms would still collect souls. It might also be fair that a humanity is gained for every 5 invaders killed, or something along those lines. This makes sense, of course. Only the host would be allowed to flask, and phantoms having nearly unlimited spells, so long as they kept winning, would probably ruin the experience for the invaders and PvE alike. Does this mean we would be seeing people drinking the appropriate amount of flasks before touching the bloodstain, so that every player was fully healed and their flasks were also fully restored after the fact? Yes, but only so much can be accounted for. I suppose there is some workarounds for phantoms not being able to be healed while a bloodstain is present, but actually that's a really great idea. This would also force the host to hurry up and collect the bloodstain if more invaders or challenging mobs are nearby. Now, let's apply this bloodstain mechanic to the invader. The invader, especially if they are fighting 2 or 3 people, would be able to collect a bloodstain from every opponent that dies. The invader wouldn't be able to heal anyway, so there's no rush incentive to collect the bloodstain outside of being killed and it obviously disappearing. I suppose the bloodstains that exist for the host to collect would also disappear if they were killed. This would allow them to appropriately conquer those gangs who seek to team up on invaders. Of course, their bloodstain pickups would only refill their HP and spells, but with one added incentive perhaps. They can only get their souls and humanity from collecting the bloodstains. It's a little thing, but it could be the necessary element. Returning to the original mechanic proposed, that of the sustained co-op, an invader would likely respawn right outside the boss fog, while the host and phantoms would obviously use the bonfire. I suppose a necessary safety zone should be required for the hosting team, because otherwise the invader could stand right there and camp. Camping sucks hard, and I would not want it in a Souls title. This then leads to another problem of the hosting party simply hanging out in their safety room annoyingly like cowards. However, why would anyone wanting to play the game do this, and also the invader could simply black sign out if they become bored. There are already instances of hosts and invaders alike hiding and wasting time. Another concern I thought of is a party blasting their way through the level, using all their resources in order to get the host to the boss safely and in perfect condition. They then die, which causes the enemies to respawn, but the host is at the boss fog already. In this scenario, the host is a new player who benefits greatly from this help, and then his phantoms can simply run through the level with their expertise. I am against this possibility, and I propose that all the phantoms must be within a certain physical range for the boss fog to be accessible. Think of Anor Londo, and let's say that as an example the entire team would have to be on the stairs behind the last giant before Smoke and Ornstein can be challenged. I seriously do not see one problem at all with this entire system. If you have any complaints, suggestions, questions, or criticisms, I would love to hear them. My gut tells me that it ruins the atmosphere of the game, that of suffering and dying. It's hard to argue with this, it really is. I still don't like how I felt more afraid when playing Demon Souls instead of Dark Souls. I still do, even though I know both games by heart. There's a couple of solutions I can offer for this, the least important of the two being that this mode could be locked until completion of the game is achieved. Actually, since the series deliberately creates a harder version of itself in each iteration of New Game Plus, it could be locked for each tier, so to speak, until you have conquered it by normal means. This is slightly convoluted, and that's fine, because it pales compared to my next point. The challenge of it. As hard as Dark Souls was for some of us at the beginning, we still found ways to make it even more difficult. Challenge runs and personal limitations are the key, and I can already envision a YouTube Soul Level 1 New Game Plus 8 No Partner Mode series. We, the players, are begging for the difficulty, and it can be there while still making the game with as much fun as possible. I have put in well over 500 PvP matches now, and that is not including random invasions when I was attempting to progress through the game. I know this is a trivial amount compared to some of you, but oh well. Even after all that battle investment, one mechanic still reigns supreme in its usage percentage, abuse, and sometimes the only maneuver that a person will bother to even attempt. I am, of course, speaking of backstabs. They ruin the experience, they really do. The combat freezes, the lag is compensated for by them, they are the best answer to almost any other combat maneuver in the game. Did I mention the combat freezes? Because I can't stand that at all. There are two alterations I can suggest for the fixing of backstabs. The first is not a fix at all, but rather a dump. Throw them into the scrap pile, because they're a broken disaster that ruins the Soul series. I said it. And I'm not taking it back. However, such a strong statement cannot be made without an alternative given. It's hard to argue that receiving a strike on your rear side should not administer greater damage. It's a video game first most, and one that is technically an RPG, so the concept of a sneak attack damage modifier does make sense. In terms of physicality, striking an opponent's back, even if armored, will likely relinquish greater damage because they cannot be guarding that perspective as well. Which is why I propose that doing so does give a damage modifier, but not a backstab. You move behind the enemy like normal, possibly out of their range. You can still roll stab, you can still poise or shield through their assault. However, you don't go into some ludicrous animation that causes an obscene amount of health to be taken away. Don't misunderstand me. My primary problem with the backstab mechanic is not the amount of damage that is caused. It's the fact that it freezes the battle, gives the backstabber an immediate advantage, and becomes all that is used. Instead of that animation, you can simply do greater damage. No animation, no safety net that grants invincibility, no setting up the other player for further backstabs or damage otherwise. An attack to someone's backside simply grants a greater critical hit. There is already a modifier in place for when you score a critical hit or counterattack. Just to use rough numbers and keep it simple, let's say your weapon does 100 damage with a normal swing. A counter hit does 110, and then a backstrike does 120. I wouldn't even want it to be a hard percentage, by the way. There are some weapons, that I'm sure will be in the next game, that do quite a large amount of damage. Sometimes this is over half of someone's health, so a backstrike percentage increase might still kill them. It will always be a bit more. Noticeable, but not game-breaking as the backstab mechanic is currently. This would become a great balance, too, against the concern I just listed. The quicker your weapon swings, usually, the less damage it does. We all know some instances in which this is not true, but I'm going to continue anyway. So, if you use a fast-swinging short sword after a roll and turn behind your opponent, you'll be very likely to score that backstrike. The opponent could still be in mid-swing or mid-cast, and may not have yet the opportunity to turn. If you are using a larger weapon, again one that would typically do more damage, even if your opponent was in mid-swing when you roll dodge behind them, they could have found the time to turn enough degrees to cancel the backstrike out. By the way, this attack is just a normal attack, which is coincidentally aimed at a bonus damage zone. That means it can still be blocked, parried, and poised through. This would help immensely with it not becoming abused. The mind game of combat would increase if you know your backstrike could be parried, and you were fighting someone who already proved themselves parry capable. Really quick, while I didn't plan on including this part in the video, I realized when I was recording just now that I brought up the issue of parrying, which also freezes combat, but didn't work it into my backstrike mechanic. So, just to be clear, there's no reason that the backstrike mechanic I proposed can't be applied to parries as well. The player who is parried would get into a frozen animation for a moment, but the parrier, the one doing the striking, would simply hit them with the normal attack, so that they would not be granted immunity during that time as well. Now, there are two immediate problems that arise from this proposal. The first behind a complaint, that from those of you who will whine that backstabs are perfect and no change is necessary. To you, I have no response, because we clearly want to play two different games. I want to experience medieval-esque martial arts, and you want to fish for backstabs. We will have to flat out disagree and will never see eye to eye. The other problem, however, is of greater legitimacy. We all know, unfortunately, that backstabs are not going to go away. Too many people do prefer them, they have been in the previous two Souls titles, and From is not going to remove them. This is a true shame because it would add much greater challenge to the PvE as well, but alas, it's a stupid world. So, knowing that backstabs will not be turned into backstrikes, at least not in full, I have created a second proposal. This will not satisfy those of you who enjoy backstabs, but it's at least an attempt at a middle ground concept. You see, another of my biggest complaints about backstabs is the physical impossibility of them in most cases. If you are tightly circling your enemy, or even roll behind them and turn sharply, while wielding an axe the size of a person, you are not going to be able to perform a backstab. It simply wouldn't happen. Think about it. Between the swing speed, the physical dimensions required for the attack, and one other fact, getting off a backstab would be impossible. That other fact? The part in which a backstab would be a surprise maneuver. The very nature suggests a sneak attack, not one in which you happen to be behind your opponent. This is going to be a two-part concept, so hang on. First, in that you still want to perform backstabs in some instances when engaged in combat, the weapons capable of such a technique should be limited. You're not going to use a claymore after circling around your enemy, rubbing against them, for the backstab animation. Since we don't know the weapons that will be in Dark Souls 2, I'm going to use a list from Dark Souls. Only the following weapons should be allowed for backstab use once engaged in combat: Dagger, Ghost Blade, Bandit's Knife, Parrying Dagger, Priscilla's Dagger, Short Sword, Scimitar, Shotel, Painting Guardian Sword, Jagged Ghost Blade, Mailbreaker, Cestus, Claws, and the Dragon Bone Fist. In case you don't pick up on the trait they all have in common, it's that they are small in stature. If within headbutting distance of your opponent, which is what is required to perform a backstab, or should be at least, you should have to be wielding a weapon that is capable of physically striking and being maneuvered in such a small space to a weak point in the opponent's defenses. I'm not even comfortable with the entire list that I read off, but I didn't want to make it too short. Besides, there's another component that I have yet to share. The key term is engaged in combat. You should be able to sneak up on your opponent and deal a backstab with any weapon, despite all that I just said. If the target has not yet noticed you, a task accomplished by locking on, then you are free to administer a backstab. Only the one, however, and that's the trick. This would allow for more use out of certain rings and spells that are overlooked by most of the PvP community. I also think actual invisibility should be implemented, to the point of only being detectable like Priscilla, and it would not wear until you are actually struck. With that in mind, even I would be alright with more than one backstab. It would become the backstabbed player's responsibility to realize they were backstabbed, watch the footprints, and keep their back safe while getting a hit in to remove the invisibility. Now, of course, this will bring up the flasking problem, which I assume will still exist in the next game in some form or another. I'm also completely fine with backstabs being allowed by any weapon if the target is flasking or using humanity. You really have to make yourself vulnerable if you are willing to ruin the fight. Another thing that entered my mind is what to have occur if you do happen to get into the backstab position with a larger weapon. Ignoring the obvious for a moment, I originally thought up the Knockdown Mechanic. You strike the target on their back, or back of their head with the hilt, handle, or pommel of your large weapon. The physical spacing issue is then removed because that is a much smaller attack. Performing this knockdown attack does not deal a great amount of damage. In fact, it would administer less damage than a normal swing. The purpose is to gain some space from an aggressive opponent, possibly still set them up for a follow-up attack, switch a piece of gear, or whatever. While I still enjoy this idea, a better solution was mentioned in this same section. If you are in the backstab range with a too large a weapon, then instead of performing a backstab, you peel off a backstrike. The two concepts work together wonderfully to create a vastly superior version of backstab combat. I suppose the complaint can still be made that many will likely be carting around a dagger offhand to get backstab still. However, unless they have the proper stat investment, as how it is in Dark Souls, that damage will not be significant. Annoying as hell still, but this proposition is in the knowledge that backstabs won't ever be fully removed. By the way, if an opponent happens to have 40 or 50 dexterity, and is a backstab monster, that's alright by me. I don't think, or at least I desperately hope, that it won't become the only build people use. Especially if casting speed is removed from dexterity, the problem should work itself out. Alas, if only casting speed were tied to resistance, or some other stat. Imagine the interesting challenge of creating builds then. But anyway. I support the Bottomless box glitch, and the Dragonhead glitch. I'm sure some of you watching this will as well, but understand that I do not support low-level griefing or glitching during PvP in any form. Those are what are bad about the two glitches, and why I understand that From inevitably was forced to remove them. However, their place in the game felt rather necessary. Let's look at the true reason that such glitches were not meant to be included in the first place. That's not the same reason that they were eventually taken out. The glitches were taken out because of the griefing and hacks that nearly made PvP pointless. Pointless because you could use the Dragonhead glitch to throw infinite black firebombs, for example. The reason these glitches were not meant to be included in the first place, however, was because of the effort that was supposed to be included in reaching a PvP character. As much as the players strive for PvP, considering it the most important aspect of the game, even to the point of ignoring PvE, it was never supposed to be the focus. Now, why do I say that? It can be argued heavily, even by me, that From cares considerably about the PvP. They spend the time balancing the gameplay with PvP in mind, but this is because of the fans, not their design. Proof in point, they removed the Bottomless box and Dragonhead glitch. Glitches and hacks still exist in the game, undeniably more so for the 360 and PC, and yet From went to the trouble of removing the two glitches that made creating characters easy and fun. The reason why? They want the struggle, the painstaking process of surviving through the game, to prevent anyone from creating numerous PvP characters. More accurately, they want their game to always exist and be an important part of any character's life. It was never in the plans to have people skip most of the game by making it a joke with a character that starts out at soul level 125. Their intention was to always have you struggle, so that each character felt as if an investment, and you would be more likely to stick with it and learn to play the character you made, even if it wasn't perfect. They never intended for people to create and create and create until their characters became perfect. This is in defiance of the point of the Souls series. It's supposed to be brutal so that you respect the time you've already put in. Now hold on a minute, don't get the wrong idea despite all that offensive talk against the glitches. As I said, I favor them and wish that they had not been removed. However, I also detest the low-level griefers. What really should be inserted in the next Souls game is a PvP mode. The best scenario I was able to come up with was a separate mode in which everything you earn in the regular game becomes available in the PvP mode. In short, you go through the game, fighting the bosses and invaders alike per normal, and everything that you pick up becomes selectable in the other mode. This would still mean that certain items, those you get from Gwyn's Soul for example, would require multiple playthroughs before you can possibly store everything. To be clear, and I suppose fair, I would say that any spells, consumables, keys, and covenant rewards, if those still exist in the next game, should have to be obtained every playthrough no matter what. It would be weird to select spells at the beginning of a PvP mode character, especially since they could go through the game again and get a second copy too easily. And yes, the PvP mode would still require you to go through the game. It would be very similar to the normal mode, in fact, except that you can take in fully powered characters from the start. Why? Because the point has become to concentrate on PvP, quickly working your way to whatever spells you want while unlocking the PvP hotspots. As I said, invasions in the regular mode would still happen, and hopefully with great frequency. There is the concern that after a few months, when everyone has every item unlocked, then the regular mode will go dead. This is a valid concern. I would hope it's not true, and at the very least I know that a regular mode of the game would be better for any challenge runs. To be slightly specific before I make another suggestion, The PvP mode character would start fresh, and you would simply select a certain number of weapons and armor they could start with. Actually, I suppose the best solution would be to have one item for each category. At this point I'm going to rescind my idea partially because the concern that the regular game would become unplayed is very real. With that in mind, we all know that the arena that was added in Dark Souls is nearly a failure. It takes far too long to load into matches most of the time, and you have to get more than halfway through the game to even participate. So how about this? The arena mode becomes the PvP mode I was speaking of. Every item you collect is available the same as I said before, after you collect them in the regular game, and then you can easily pop whatever soul level character you want, be it 50, 100, 125, 200, or beyond. Since we are now talking about timed matches, I have no problem with the gear selection being unlimited. You're unlikely to get off a whole lot of gear switching in the arena anyway. Also imagine that all the PvP action that exists in Dark Souls currently is still prominent, but that certain covenants like the dragons and gravelords function even better, and if you are skilled enough to get powerful weapons at a low level, griefing is available to you. This would keep plenty of life in the regular game, perhaps more than the arena still. However, now the arena would also become popular, especially if it functioned correctly. You know, with minimal waiting times. You would be able to quickly make out and try new characters to your heart's content, and no glitches would exist to ruin or alter the PvE experience. This next idea is one that should have likely been included in the previous PvE video, but it does relate to PvP. Also, I hadn't thought of it until well after that video was made, so that option never even existed. I would really like for all the stats used in character creating to be impacting. If you don't know what I mean, resistance in Dark Souls is a joke. It truly is. No build should ever put a single point into it. I've read the argument that some dragon form builds can benefit from having some resistance points, and perhaps that is true. However, having one stat become only slightly acceptable for one build type that most do not use is not at all acceptable. Therefore, resistance is lame. Before going further into what to do with resistance, I need to explain why this thought came into my head at all. It has always bothered me that dexterity increases casting speed. It bothers me because it does not make any sense. First, from a role-playing perspective, the less important of the two perspectives, the speed of spellcasting should not be based around the deftness of the hand. Not at all. Your hand is already holding a catalyst, or other manifestation tool, and the arm is primed for casting. No, it is the swiftness of the mind, or the focus, that grants faster casting. The greater the wizard, the more intelligent they are, and the faster their mental prowess would allow them to form and issue the spell in question. Secondly, and more importantly, having dexterity as the attribute that increased casting speed does not make sense from a metagame perspective. I dislike using that term for my video only because it suggests intimate details, so let's say instead that dexterity influencing casting speed is a mistake from a build equality point of view. Why is that? Dexterity already has weapons that unleash massive damage and often at rapid rates. This by itself is not such a bad thing. However, it can then be used in a hybrid build with intelligence, faith, and pyromancy more easily. Why do I say more easily? In the current Dark Souls system, they only need to add 5 points of dexterity after 40, the number when diminishing returns begin, to reach the maximum casting speed at 45. This also still benefits their dexterity weapon bonus, however. Now, compare this fact with a faith, intelligence, or strength build that does not also have points invested in dexterity, outside of a minimal low number goal acquired to use whatever weapon the build is based around. Even if they use pyromancy, they lose the necessary effect of hastily casting. They also have to bring their primary stats somewhere between 40 and 50, lest their build be gimped in terms of damage. This by itself would be forgivable, if not for pyromancy. A magic type free of stat requirements means that dexterity builds get to weapon murder and fire murder their opponents. An intelligence build without dexterity becomes practically pointless in PvP, in terms of spell usage at least, and a strength build is already handicapped by the fact that their weapons move slower than others. Faith builds don't really see the benefit of casting speed in the first place, but that is an entire other problem that can also be fixed by what I am about to suggest. I propose that the 8th useless stat, Resistance, be replaced by something incredibly useful, a stat I am calling Casting Speed, for the sake of avoiding as much complication as I can. I am only hopeful that I can explain accurately how this stat would work. Okay, what I envision is for characters who are going to invest in spells to be more awesome. Understand that is the basis for the following ideas. This casting speed stat would do exactly what it sounds like, increase the casting speed for spells. I will be referring to it as CSD from here on out. CSD would kick in, so to speak, at a certain level and a different level for every spell or every group of spells. It would also cap softly at a certain number that is different from a possible hard cap. I am purposefully going to leave the exact math out of this because it is an aspect I would have to tinker with during the production of the game, and I am certainly not involved. The following, however, is the best setup of an example I am able to create. First, let's take a pitiful spell such as Soul Arrow. This spell is never even used in PvP, outside of early zone invasions, because it will do next to nothing in terms of damage, even if it hits unguarded. Therefore, Soul Arrow would begin to see an increase in speed as soon as 10 points were invested in CSD. It would also see a soft cap at only 20, meaning that to get Soul Arrow to a competitive level, in terms of speed, you only have to invest a minimum number of points. Now before anyone points out that having a spell such as Soul Arrow being used in the first place is ridiculous, keep in mind that this would be something a low-level character might consider using and investing 20 points in CSD for. Oppositely, let's take a powerhouse spell such as Dark Bead. We all know this spell can crush just about any player in one blast if it hits. It also hits pretty damn often because it casts faster than hell and has a wide spread. For Dark Bead to even be accessed, regardless of the intelligence requirement, you could need 40 CSD. Without that investment, the spell will either simply not cast, or will be embarrassingly slow. So slow that no one would cast it unless they were hoping to be killed during the interim, which is what I prefer because it would be redundant to have 2 stat requirements to cast the spell at all. So, Dark Bead begins to see an increase at 40, and then a soft cap at 50. At this point, it would become almost as fast as we can see it now in Dark Souls. Why almost? Because, as I was made aware of by someone, a terribly annoying part about the stat Attunement is that it is entirely useless after 50. Therefore, I would prefer CSD to still gradually increase from 51 until 99. The same way that any of the primary stats continue to strengthen a weapon of choice after 50, a little bit here and there, is how CSD should also work. This increase would be negligible, but that's somewhat the point. Only the hardcore casters would bother, and ignoring this, and stopping at 50, would also allow for some possible hybrids to still see creation. Likewise, any build that has 99 CSD is unlikely to be a hybrid and use anything except spells. Now apply this, with your imagination, to the entire gamut of spells that exist in Dark Souls. Think about how powerful a certain spell is and place it somewhere in the spectrum between soft capping at 20 and 50. The different soft capping points can even be in multiples of 5 or 2. Spells could reach their soft cap at 20, 22, 24, and so on, all depending on how devastating and useful they are. Since I mentioned it, I know that an argument to this CSD stat is that having a second attribute investment practically required for casters means that a lot less hybrids could be built. At the same time, I answer to this both incorrect and that this is exactly the point. I want the strongest casters to be fully invested in their craft. They should not be tossing out multiples of the strongest, fastest spells and wielding the most powerful strength or dexterity weapons. They should not be slamming the Iaito for maximum damage and bursting great combustions within half a second. To balance this, of course, would require some tuning so that more spells are useful in PvP. This whole idea operates with the trust that From can make the third Souls game the best yet. We've already been shown that they are learning how to make spells more viable with the addition of Dark Bead. If this trend keeps up, then all will fit perfectly well with CSD. On top of that, I would argue that having 2 stats required for casters also actually allows for a better variety of hybrid builds. I'm going to pull the following out of thin air, but I believe the example will work well enough. Let's say your caster build is also going to be using the Gold Tracer. This weapon requires 25 Dexterity to use. Now you could use it at its base requirement of 25, or go anywhere up to 40. 40, of course, is the optimal number to strive for if you care about stopping before diminishing returns kick in. Assuming that otherwise you would have 50 CSD and using Dark Bead primarily, let's say you decide you only care about getting Dexterity to 25. The Dark Tracer is simply going to be a backup surprise weapon. Also, let's say that the best class choice is Pyromancer, which I do choose ironically. In doing so, you have to invest 14 points in Dexterity to reach 25. This could be taken away from your CSD, Endurance, Vitality, or Attunement. All of this could be balanced out, but for the sake of simplicity, let's elect CSD as the only stat sacrificed. This would mean that your CSD is now going to be 36. Dark Bead has now become pointless, but other spells are still in the game. Again, this is without bothering to make a giant math problem. At 36 CSD, let's say the spells Soul Spear and Greater Combustion hit their soft cap. This would still be an excellent decision then, because those spells are an option in PvP, especially if they fix the online portion a bit and tweak the spells some. Just to have another example, and still only subtracting from CSD, let's say you want to have your Dexterity at 40, so that your Gold Tracer is an extra deadly primary weapon. Well, now your CSD is going all the way down to 21. At first blush, this seems abysmal, and ruins my entire point, but hear this. Combustion, Fire Surge, and Great Soul Arrow all soft cap at 20. That means you could put another point into Vitality or Endurance and lower your CSD by 1 and avoid having it misused. Or better said, avoid having a point invested inappropriately and spent better in a different stat. Now just for fun, let's also say that Homing Soul Mass soft caps at 30 CSD. So you decide to lower your Dexterity and Vitality each a few points, still allowing both to be viable in PvP, and your build could be a serious contender. Your Dexterity would become 34 and your Vitality, I don't know, 46. I should also point out a side proposal of a constant speed increase of something around 2% for every point invested in CSD, related to all spells across the board. While this is also a great idea, and perhaps a better one or perhaps not, it requires too much math for this concept and this vid. As for a tough question, it's hard to say whether non-offensive spells should be bothered to be affected by CSD at all. It would seem stupid to say they are not, despite their lack of use in PvP. At the very least, buffs should be strongly affected, because the risk of using such a thing should certainly come with a drastic punishment, since the reward is so grand. However, when I think of spells like Cast Light and Fall Control, I fail to see a purpose in having them be slower, aside from not having weird, irritating exclusions. That's that, especially since this video has gone on for what feels like a year. I'm sure there are other ideas for PvP that are worth mentioning, but these are what I think and hope From focuses on. I'm not saying I have all the answers, or the best, but I'll be damned if I bother with PvP all that much the next go-around if backstabs are still fished for.